Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jordan Reese, and I am the Director of Media Relations at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We are the largest philanthropy in the nation dedicated to making sure everyone in America has everything they need to be healthy, no matter where they live, no matter who they are. I want to thank you all for joining us today to learn more about the American Communities Project's new report, A New Portrait of Rural America, and that will include conversations with key leaders from the communities covered in the report. The report uses the project's unique 15 community types developed by Dante, Chinni, and his team at George Washington University, alongside data and on-the-ground reporting in rural and tribal areas to explore the differences within and across these communities. Dante and his partner, Ari Pincus, will get into the details of the report with you, but to suffice to say, it continues to blow up the mythology that rural America is one big place with the same type of people and the same type of challenges. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was proud to lend its support to this important effort and will continue to do so, to develop a more comprehensive understanding around the strengths and the gaps and the threats to health and well-being in rural communities. As we look at national health trends, rural places are behind, and they're lagging further behind. And within these rural counties, there are stark disparities in health. Native Americans, African Americans, and Latinx populations all experience worse outcomes in rural places than their white neighbors do. And the factors that drive these health disparities vary widely, from changing economies and disinvestment in these areas to the opioid epidemic, to aging and unsafe homes and unaffordable homes. And ironically, unaffordable homes can come at a pretty low price. And then there's also a lack of public transportation as well, and broadband access and capabilities. But there are bright spots all across rural America. Local leaders are bucking national trends and working across disciplines. They're working across racial and ethnic groups and across party lines to improve the conditions in their communities and regions. And there's a lot that we can learn from them. The foundation is not new to rural. For decades we've funded in this space, but we know that there's a lot more to learn, and so that's what we're going to do today. Like you, we're here to learn from and about rural communities. And we look forward to working with all of you and with Dante and Ari and her team as well to lift up a more nuanced understanding of the many rural experiences and contexts so that we can improve health and equity and opportunity in our nation for everyone. So thank you for your time, and please allow me to introduce to you Dante Chinni.
Thank you, Jordan. And thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for funding this effort. Thank you to GW, George Washington University, where we are based, the American Communities Project. I'm glad you're all here. There's clearly nothing else going on in Washington today, so thank you for taking the time to come by. I want to talk a little bit about the report. You have this 4-page handout, and that really just kind of encapsulates what's in the report. The report is very lengthy. It lives online. What you have is really just a summary of what's in there. I want to talk a little bit about the report, how we did the report, why we did the report the way we did it, and let's start off with the most basic question. What is rural? We spend a lot of time talking about rural in America. It's become a very popular topic. And in people's mind's eye, I think this is what rural means to them. It's old. It's white. It's an Appalachian, a story about Appalachia that you read in the New York Times, or it's about amber waves of grain or cows. And all these things are part of rural America. That's true. But they miss a lot of the complexity. So for this report, we're going to go over the data in a little bit. There are also reports on communities we went to. The communities we went to around the country showed just how much more complicated rural America is than you believe it to be. You know, yes, it is farms, it's agriculture, it's aging communities. But there's a lot of diversity in rural America. There are breweries and wineries in rural America. There is manufacturing, more manufacturing than you think in rural America. and there are the arts in rural America. But again, this is just a quick summary. When we set out to do this, knew we had one problem, and that was, how do you even talk about rural America without defining it? Talk to people in Washington, D.C., even at different government agencies, you get very different ideas of what rural America looks like. Sometimes it's metropolitan, micropolitan, sometimes it's rural, sometimes it's things that don't even get a category. After talking to a lot of people around town, we settled on this idea. We have 15 different kinds of community types we look at in the country, everything from big cities to different kinds of suburban America to different kinds of rural America. And we merged that with the HRSA's Rural Health Grants Eligibility Analyzer. So what you do is you go in there, they'll tell you whether or not your community qualifies as rural in their eyes. And that's the Health Resources and Services Administration. We took their definition of rural counties, or places that hold rural counties, our definition of all the counties in the country, and we wound up with this. These are the 9 community types that we look at in the American Communities Project, where 80% or more of the counties in them are either completely rural or hold rural territory. And you can see, even looking at some of these names, you get a feel for some of the complexity of rural America. Native American lands, aging farmlands, graying America, working class country, Hispanic centers. Rural Middle America, LDS enclaves, evangelical hubs, the African American South. The thing that is really interesting when we looked at this data is after you get beyond those 9, it drops pretty precipitously. All these places, 80% or more of the counties are rural, as analyzed by HRSA's measure of rural. And this is what those types look like on a map. Okay, so this is all of them together. And the first thing is, it's a lot of counties. It's 2,243 counties from coast to coast, from Maine to Nevada, from Washington to Florida. It is an extensive mix of places, an extensive coverage on the map, and a very complicated mix of places. This is what it looks like, and you'll see when you get online and you look at the report online, which is americancommunities.org/rural report. You can go through, and there's an interactive where you can literally go through each one of these counties and look at a bunch of important measures, everything from white non-Hispanic population to miles of road. That's what they all look like together. I want to go through them really quickly, just a little bit of definition of what these communities are. The African American South, as you can see, 306 counties, primarily in what's thought of as the Black Belt, in the running through the southeastern United States. Virginia to Texas, really. All right, I guess Maryland to Texas. Lower median household incomes, about $38,000. High child poverty. And you're talking about 14% of people in these communities do not have insurance. But set against that, you can look at the aging farmlands. 94% white. This is, I think, in a lot of people's mind's eye, what rural America looks like. This is agricultural America. The leading industry is agriculture, and interestingly, of these 9 community types we look at, aging farmlands is the only one where agriculture is the leading employer. Healthcare gap is a little lower. Something that's really interesting about these communities, 68% of the residents have at least some education beyond college or beyond high school. That's a pretty high number. It's the highest number we saw out of all the rural communities we went to. The evangelical hubs, you can see kind of scattered throughout the center of the country. It's slightly lower median household incomes, high health insurance gap, 13% uninsured. And health concerns, it's a very high teen birth rate in these communities, which is something that probably does merit more study. We could not get into it in this report, but it's worth looking into, I think. Graying America. Graying America is a very interesting type. It is made up of 2 different kinds of places in my mind. One is places where a lot of younger people have left, and one is places where a lot of old people have moved to. So if you look at some of those places down in Florida, it's very nice down there. It's very warm. And you look out in Arizona, but even up in Michigan, I mean, where I'm from originally, there are communities when you get further north that are actually quite, that fit more of these things, little higher median household income. They're actually doing fairly well in some of these places. It's a really interesting mix of communities that's, again, I think worthy of more study. Hispanic centers, you can see, run from the border, the Mexican border. But that's not the only place where they are. They go up through the middle of the country. In fact, one of the communities we visited for this report was Finney County in Kansas. Very large Hispanic population. The healthcare number in here is quite high. Without health insurance, talk about 18% without health insurance in these communities, 40 and lower education rates. But the income levels are fairly decent in these places. You're talking $46,000, which again, by the rural metric, and you can see in here when you get into the report what the medians are. It's not that bad. LDS enclaves based out largely around Utah, as you might expect. Highest income of any place we looked at, almost $55,000 median household income, quite high actually. Higher education rates, lower lower numbers of uninsured. Also, as you might expect, high youth population, 29% under the age of 18. Native American communities, primarily based around reservations around the country, lower median household income, very young communities, youth population 31% under the age of 18. As we explain in the report, that statistic is a little deceptive because it has something to do with there are fewer older people in these places, the mortality rates are a little higher. But there are a lot of young people in these communities, which emphasizes some of the challenges they have in terms of education. 48% with only 48% with some college, only 72% graduate from high school. And again, that healthcare number very high, 18% without insurance. Rural Middle America, by far the largest group we look at, 551 counties. Really, you can look almost from coast to coast, but primarily in the northern part of the country. I like to think of this really as small town America. These are places where you've got an old downtown, a main street, and people are, there is like an urban center, and then spreading out around it more of the rural area. The urban centers are in general fairly small, but they're dealing with some of the challenges of an urban community and some of the challenges of a rural community. Very low uninsured rate, only 7%. I think that has to do with the employers in these places, which tend to be, there are some national employers in these places which provide health insurance. And then working class country. Working class country, I think of it really more as Appalachian America, though you can see it spread all around the country, which is an interesting point. High child poverty rate, 24%. Median household income, about $44,000. Very interesting. The healthcare gap is low. Most people in these communities do have insurance. We're going to talk about 9% without health insurance. There are places, I think, that are still coming to terms with their identity, and a lot of these places, employment is a real challenge. That's what it looks like from 30,000 feet. Those are the maps. That gives you a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about this complex picture of rural America. These are kind of the 6 key findings we take away. When we look at it and we take all the medians from these places and like, all right, what does it all mean? First of all, this is a remarkably diverse landscape, much more diverse than you'd think. 500 of these counties fall into the African American South, Hispanic centers, Native American lands. These are places that are below average for white non-Hispanic, not just not 90%, but they're below the national average for white non-Hispanic population. 2, the economic challenges and opportunities really are remarkably different. And I think this is where this is where people's heads are a lot right now. What can we do to help rural America, to fix rural America? When you go out and look at the challenges of these places, they're just remarkably different. Again, you have those high incomes in those LDS communities, LDS enclaves, and then much lower in the African American South. Both rural communities, very different. Another point, the childhood poverty rate. I think one of the most important things we found is the importance of education. So all the places with the highest unemployment rates we looked at in this survey, this kind of study that we did, were below the rural America average, not the national average, the rural America average for population with some college education, so some education beyond high school. And as we look at it, it started to make us wonder, as you'll read in the report in a little more depth, about the need maybe for more work with community colleges, because the community colleges are a way to kind of keep people in the community, educate them, turn them back out, and you've got a more productive workforce. And then as you've seen just going through the slides, stark differences in terms of healthcare and healthcare coverage. Working class country, only 9%. Hispanic centers, 18% uninsured. There's been a lot of talk about population loss in rural America. We do see that in the data, but it really varies. So The African American South, 80% of the rural communities we looked at have lost population since 2010. That is a high number. Remember, the U.S. population is growing. Even if you're growing at 1 or 2%, you're still growing under the national average. These places have lost population. However, you go to graying America, fewer than 50% of those rural counties have lost population, and many have grown, and grown significantly. The last point, infrastructure. We looked at roads in this report, and we looked at digital infrastructure, internet connections. And the interesting thing is how varied the reality is with both these things. Aging farmlands, low population. These are fairly small communities, but they're actually fairly well connected by roads. I think that has something to do with the economies of these places and the need to move machinery and equipment and crops and anything involving agriculture around. African American South, much lower, even though there are many more people in those places, much more density, fewer roads. Internet connections, really different. If you look at mobile internet, I will say it's pretty remarkable how much mobile internet there is out there. A lot of people now, I don't know what coverage is a different question. We're just talking about whether people have access. A lot of people have mobile internet access. But when you talk about having a real line at home, like a high-speed connection at home, Hispanic centers, 80%, but then you get out to those Native American communities, it's only 40%. Real differences, again, places where we need to do some work if we're going to have economic growth and opportunity. That's just kind of a snapshot of the data. Like I said, this report is voluminous. There is a lot there. There's a lot to click on and a lot to explore. But then on top of that, along with the report, with the data part of the report, we visited 6 of these communities. Many of these people are here today. You're going to hear from them in a little bit. And we went to 2 different communities in Arkansas, Fulton and St. Francis, 2 different communities in Kansas, Finney and Gove, and then North and South Dakota, Morton, North Dakota, Todd, South Dakota. And the reason we did this, and we really would, look, there's always a lot of talk about data, and I'm a data person. I think it's important to have data to understand the picture of what's going on in a place, but I don't think you can truly understand it until you get down into these communities and talk to people and see what life is like. I would really urge you to take a look at these profiles of these places because they're fascinating. They're fascinating communities. They're fascinating people that live in them. And it's something that you have to have if you're gonna truly understand how to help rural America. You got to understand what the picture looks like on the ground. So what does this all mean? For us, 3 big takeaways. First, these communities are really diverse, and they have different strengths, and they face different challenges. Okay, they're driven by different kinds of economies and different sorts of people. What does that all mean? To us, it means that a lot of the conversation around rural America in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere is a bit misguided. That we spend a lot of time talking about rural America as a big blanket entity, and it's really made up of different places that need different approaches. There is no one-size-fits-all to help rural America. These places need different approaches and really different ways of reaching out to them. And that's a quick overview of everything. You have the 4-page summary, and right now, I'd just like to take any questions you might have. I guess that's a lot to just throw out there, but any questions from the audience? Yep. So our demographic data, okay.
I will ask again, what is the source of your demographic data?
Our demographic data is coming from the Census ACS because we had to use 5-year ACS because you need data at every county, and the 5-year data is the only data that lets you really do that. So, I will say, this is a very important group that I forgot to acknowledge when I came up here, and that's the county health rankings and roadmaps from Robert Wood Johnson. We work with those folks, and they basically do this massive report every spring. They took all their county health data, put it through the filter that we have to look at these places separately. So they take tons and tons of data from ACS and others and flush it through the filter we have to create a lot of the statistics that we have in this report. Yeah.
I'm curious in terms of the population of each of these relative to each other and to the country as a whole.
So the way we try to do it, and you'll see in the report, is compared to the country as a whole, this is not a large percentage of population. We talk about it in the report, trying to talk about the median for each, trying to talk about them as places specifically. So in the aging farmlands, you're talking about a median. The median county is about, I think, 2,800 people, I want to say, something like that. And then you can get quite a bit bigger when you get out into the African-American South. You're talking about places that are 28, 29, 30,000 in the county. Now, in the county, sometimes that's an urban center surrounded by a lot of rural area. But compared to what you see when you look at the national population picture, look, U.S. population is highly concentrated in 150, 200, 300 counties. And we did not look at anything like that. So you're talking about, in terms of total population of the United States represented in this report, we actually haven't done the calculation because we were really trying to focus on these specific communities. But you're talking probably about like 10%, 15%.
And then among them, what's the relative size? Where's the most urban, rural people?
So that's one way of thinking about it. The most rural communities we look at are the aging farmlands. They're very sparsely populated communities, and they're places where you really are talking this depopulation. So it's interesting, when we talk about depopulation, the depopulation numbers are highest in terms of just loss in terms of the African-American South, but the hits that you're feeling in these aging farmlands communities are in some ways much more dramatic, because you're talking about communities where if you lose a couple hundred people, you've remade the community. And rural middle America, again, bigger community, but the smallest communities we're looking at are the aging farmlands in terms of overall population.
Thanks for this presentation. I have a question about, so you've identified lots of very different communities. A question about the extent to which our government policy reflects that diversity. So we have, of course, American Indian policies, we have Appalachian policies, we have farm policies. How do the policies align?
So that is not something we looked at particularly closely in this report. We're hoping this is a tool for people to do that a little better. My inkling from going out to these communities and looking at the data is it's not terribly well organized. I mean, we do have ag policy, obviously, and we have policy for Native American communities. But for instance, I do know this a little bit. Like if you look at the map of Appalachia as the U.S. government sees it, a lot of those communities, I mean, yes, they fall into the region we would call Appalachia, but like they're all they can be very different communities. Again, like the Great Lakes region of the United States is, people think of it as one place, but I'll take you up to Michigan and I'll show you the difference between Detroit and Traverse City, and they're different communities. I don't think that policy in general is aligned this way. I think it's aligned around regions, and I think it's aligned sometimes around economic sectors. But I think what we're arguing for in this report is something that is a little more aligned along these lines. Something that looks at these places community by community and the differences in the types, because communities are made up of individuals, but those individuals interact to create a place. And you have to think about how things happen in that place, I think, if you want to create proper policy.
Hello, thank you for the report. You said that 80% of the rural community in the African-American South has lost population since 2010.
Those counties, yep.
Yeah, I'm curious to ask where they're going, because a lot of what I'm reading is saying that African Americans, there's a kind of reverse migration. They're going back south.
Yep.
Is it safe to say that they're going to the larger cities in the South? And where are the rural African Americans going if they're not going north?
So that's a really good question, and we did not. I will say we did not look at that specifically in this report. However, from other work that I do, I can tell you the reverse migration data, which is fascinating. The Great Migration back south. It's in urban centers. I mean, it's like look at the growth around Atlanta. It's phenomenal. And I think what you're seeing in those rural southern communities, again, this is worthy of another report, so we can talk to Robert Johnson. But in these rural African-American South communities, I think you're seeing the same impacts that you see in some of these aging farmlands communities or some of these more rural communities where the population is not as diverse. Look, it's opportunity. I think a lot of times young people who get the education leave. I mean, I know that is something that I've seen in when I'm not doing this, I'm a reporter. And I've seen that in my reporting that, the best and the brightest from the community get an opportunity to go to college, and then it's tough to get them to come back.
Hi, I'm from HRSA. I run the Rural Grants Eligibility Analyzer. If you're picking up all our rural people and adding in some more from the rest of from the counties that have rural area in them that are metro, you're getting about 60 million people probably, and so about almost 20% of the population.
So we cut out. But remember, we didn't use. So for our devices, we didn't use the most densely populated places that still do. That's a very important comment, very important point. A lot of suburban areas have suburban counties have rural elements to them. We did not include them in this report. So like we have urban suburbs, we have exurbs, even big cities, big city counties have rural elements to them. For this report, we didn't want to include them. We were really trying to focus on the most rural kinds of place in America. But yeah, I take your point. Absolutely. I mean, Maricopa County it's a huge county, has some large rural tracts in it.
Thank you again for this report. I think it's a very interesting way of slicing rural communities. I just wanted to add a couple of things. I work at USDA, so obviously we do a lot of rural policy and programs. Just wanted to put a plug in for our Economic Research Service that does an annual report on the differences in rural communities. We're well aware of the diversity of rural communities, and they slice it a little differently, looking at manufacturing versus recreation economies.
Yep.
So it's based on that. And then also want to let people know, since it's fascinating and heartening to see so many people interested in rural issues, so that rural development is a mission area in USDA, and we have a wealth of programs and tools to assist rural communities. So take a look at that as well.
Thank you. Where are we time-wise? Are we okay?
A couple more minutes.
Thank you, Dante, for the report, and thank you, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I'm curious, when we're looking at the data, we focused on Native American lands, but I'm wondering if you're thinking of Alaska and we are interpreting the data, what should we be considering? Because it's more remote than rural, but it's closer than urban. So can you give me some insight on interpreting and reading the report?
By the way, she deserves credit for being the person who traveled the farthest to be here today. She came all the way down from Alaska, which is impressive, very impressive. Alaska, and I know you hear this all the time, Alaska is something of an outlier, right? It's a very complicated, environment, and that's why. I believe that the way we do this, and the way we break these counties into types, I think is meaningful. That said, Alaska is really tough because it's just so big and so diverse, and the counties are enormous. I mean, a lot of them are boroughs, right? We should talk after because it is a complicated place. Yep.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to know I work for Weave the Social Fabric Project, which is at Aspen focusing on community strength. And I'd like to know, we've traveled to a number of places, and in some places, these indicators don't correlate with the palpable strength of a community. And so I'd love to know if there are any generalizations that are possible, like where you saw strength in each of these places and what kind.
Actually, we have something in Ari will probably talk about this. We have something in the report that actually deals with this. So you're talking about intense like social structures, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's very difficult to measure, but there are some people that measure it, and we do have a section in the report that talks about this. Ari, Ari, do you want to? That was your section. Do you want to come up and say something really quickly about it? I know we're over time, but I know this is something near and dear to her heart.
We did talk about social capital a little bit. It came up in Morton County, actually, and the health administrator was saying that they really need to kind of understand how to redefine their community identity. Millennials, he was saying, do like to network, but they do it online. They don't necessarily go from to a place to gather. And that shows up in the data too, with the Penn State Research does data on the social capital, and so it shows up that they are kind of below average there. So it does come up in different communities, and it's something I'm very interested in.
It's something we want to do more exploring, and actually with the ACP. One thing I would say too is that when you talk about this community, just kind of bonds at the community level, these aging farmlands do tend to have they have very strong bonds. And I think. Look, I've seen this in other reporting I've done, as you've gone to these communities, that, you go to a community and something happens and there's a pass-the-hat mentality. But there's a pass-the-hat mentality in a lot of places. When they pass the hat in those places, there's something in the hat at the end. And it does seem that it is worthy, I think, of more study in terms of those small rural communities out in the farmlands in particular, I think there's cohesion there. There's special cohesion in those places.
Any other questions? We have time for a couple more.
Hi, you mentioned the people on the ground with whom you spoke. Excuse me. And was there anything in these conversations, was there anything that was surprising that the data maybe didn't capture, even if a story that you have is anecdotal?
Actually, yeah. So we had some so you'll see on the next panel, we have people in, they're scattered around the room right now from around the country in different communities. And Ari will get to this in this panel, but just really interesting things that are on their mind that weren't really on our mind. It's Erica who's sitting in the front row right here. It makes you, the things that they brought up as concerns sometimes were surprising to us. And I find this when I go out and do any kind of reporting, that it makes you go back and look at the data differently. I know in Forest City, the mayor's here, down in St. Francis County, Arkansas, for instance, we were down there and we did not expect to see, I mean, you think of like the trade fight that's going on right now, and you think of who gets hurt in the trade fight, and we expected to see it in agricultural America, and we did. We heard those stories when we were in Gove County, Kansas. But, you know, you go down there and you hear a story about there's a plant on the edge of town that they're waiting to be, it's been purchased by a Chinese company and waiting for it to be rebuilt and retooled, and it's going to bring a lot of economic activity to the community. It's a big deal. And how that has put a stall on that. The trade fight that's going on has put a stall on that. That's fascinating. And that's stuff like, those are things that don't turn up in the data, that when you get out there, you realize there's something going on at this local level that you would have missed otherwise. It's fascinating stuff.
So, hello, Shay McNeil from National 4-H Council. I actually manage a grant called Well Connected Communities that's funded by Robert Wood Johnson. So we use community county health rankings and roadmaps and all that data. But something I wanted to go back to, because we were talking about social capital. I don't know if you have had a chance to read 4-H Council did a study with the Bridgespan Group on social mobility in rural America, and they identified 6 key factors that that are existing in communities where youth are thriving. So that's something. If you haven't had a chance to read it, there's, you know, because we're talking. It sounds like we're talking a lot about, you know, communities that, you know, are considered rural America, but they are thriving, you know, because they have, you know, things related to social capital and reclaiming or redefining their identity as a community. So,
thank you. And then and particularly because I know about your project, but so data at the county level for us would be like anything we can get the data at the county level that would let us kind of look at it through this filter we have would be fascinating for us.
Hi, I didn't read the entire report. I'm going to ask you a question.
There's a lot of it.
There's a lot to it, yeah. You mentioned a loss of population in the African American South. You don't need to get too specific, but I'm wondering if there are certain things that certain rural counties are doing that are stemming the tide of population loss.
So it's actually really interesting. Down in St. Francis, they're trying to deal with some of this, and the thing that they feel that they have that's a very important asset to the community, and we agree, having gone there, is the community college. To me, I do think it's hard to overstate the power that these community colleges can have if you can have a good, strong presence nearby. Because, look, it's job retraining and things like that, but it's also the opportunity for somebody who graduates from high school to get more schooling without necessarily even leaving town. And I think that, again, education ends up just being a huge, when we look at all this data, and look, it pops up in all sorts of data, the importance of education. But I was kind of surprised how much it manifested itself in this rural data. It's just hugely important. I think anything you can do, I mean, this is speaking just from what we've seen in the data. I haven't done a big study just on this topic. But to me, anything you can do to have a community college or something that offers the opportunity for educational advancement in the community, to stay in the community, I think it's a huge plus.
Hey, Tony Pippa from Brookings. I guess one question I have is if using the typology, if there was a way, and I'm sure this is hard to understand from the data, but is there even perceptions of sort of stickiness? People staying that have grown up there, or actually leaving, going to college, going to an urban center, and then coming back and sort of investing in those communities? And is there any way to be thinking about the importance of that and actually what we really know about that?
So that's a great question. And we were not able to look at that specifically. We saw examples of it. We actually saw it in Gove County. We saw people who left and came back and they made their community. So they'd gone out to the West Coast, and they're like, well, I need to go to the store. I'll just get online and see how late something's open. And like nothing is a website. So that's something that they took an active role in kind of helping build. And I think it's called Love Small Town America, where they're trying to help rural communities build up this presence. I think it's a fascinating idea. There's a lot of I'm fascinated by cross-county mobility data that census does gather. But the one thing that's missing on it is you can't tell what individual this is. So you don't know if the person coming back is somebody who's been there before. I can't, there's no way of tracking it back. But to me, to watch the population outflows and inflows into various counties and where people are coming to and from, if you did it the right way, and I was thinking about a way of doing this, and I haven't quite figured out how to do it yet, but to look at population flows, what communities feed other communities in terms of who moves where, and what if you were able to map what it looked like, I think you'd learn a lot. That might be something for further study. The tricky part, I think, is always going to be that longitudinal way of measuring. Yeah, somebody came back. Did they live there before? That's tough to do without on the ground interviews.
Hi, Ben Gadjalori from the Center for American Progress. There's a lot of talk about population loss, and one of the things I was wondering, did you look at immigration? Because I know there's some communities that have high levels of immigration that's able to stem that tide.
So the one place we see it, obviously, in the typology is in these Hispanic centers. So when you get out to Finney County in Kansas, right, because it's if you look at the Hispanic population in the United States, it moves up through Texas and up through the western part of Kansas. It's changed that community, absolutely changed that community, and it's made it more vital. I mean, they have people to work jobs, and once you have people to work jobs, you have employers. I mean, they are a real agricultural hub, right? They got meat processing plants, chicken processing plants. They'll probably talk about that when they come up here. They've had a fire there recently, but It has allowed that place to grow. That I will say, if you ever get a chance, Finney County is absolutely fascinating because they have all sorts of immigrants from different kinds of communities, and it's allowed the community to grow. I mean, it's still not growing at the rate of the rest of the country, but it is like it can be scary in some of these rural communities because, look, one thing about being in a rural community is you're isolated to some extent. And when new people come in, you've got to get to meet them, and has to be breaking the walls down and getting to know people. The same things that hold these communities that make them so closely knit can make it hard for an outsider, I think, to get in. But when they can get over it, when a community can get over it and invite some of these people in, it really does seem like it has big economic impacts, like looking at a place like Finney in particular. But that's something, again, I'm getting a lot of ideas for further reports we should be doing up here. So I guess I'll be talking to Jordan later. But thank you.
Hi, Heidi Shepard with the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. I did want to mention, I know everybody's talking about, bringing people back to their rural communities. RCAP has an initiative that is going to be held on October 18th through 20th, although you can do it any time of the year, called Rural Homecoming. And so everybody can go on the RCAP website, or you can Google Rural Homecoming. And what it is a toolkit for communities and leaders of communities to invite and encourage and motivate people to come back to their community through different events. I don't know all of the details, but you can go and look online. And so that's one effort that we've undertaken to help this, bringing people back into their rural communities and seeing the benefit of going back home.
Yeah. I will say the one thing we did see when people do move back home, one of the things that really draws them is the experience they had growing up. They remember the childhood they had and the feeling safe on the street and being able to ride your bike wherever you went. And not that you can't do that in the city. I live in a city. It's not it's not a dangerous place. But like when you grew up in that community and you have memories of growing up there, that is when you have kids, sometimes they leave, and when they have kids, that's when the pull is to come back home. Yeah.
Time for one last question.
It's a long one.
Hi, Clifford Deaton with Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group. Very thought-provoking set of research. I'm really interested in the nuance of looking at county-level data within, say, a region.
Yeah.
And what's there seems to be some tension between wanting to grow a region economically where people and businesses are moving across county borders, and the data that you've shown here that is very county specific. This is a working class county. This is a this is a different type of county. How do you see that tension operating, and is it a productive tension, or where do you see the best avenues for combining regionalism with your analysis?
So that's particularly when you're talking about rural America, that's a really interesting question, because to me, look, some of these rural communities are part of larger urban areas, right? And the question is, are you going to get people to commute to a larger place for a job and drive 90 miles? I mean, look at Washington, D.C. and what we do around here, which is absolutely insane. But I don't think what we're arguing is that I don't think we're arguing that you should just be worrying about the county. I'm really not. I just think that at some point you need a unit of measurement. The counties are better. Look, some people will tell you counties are clumsy and they're too big. But to me, the reason we end up using counties is there's 3,100 of them. A lot of data is collected at that level. Do I think, and we saw from some of our work, that counties in these rural communities should work together and form regional approaches to problems? Yes, absolutely. But I would say that even when you do that, even at that level, I would say that if you're forming a regional approach to handling a problem, the understanding that looking at the region and say, well, this is just the region, isn't really right. You have to understand that even if that region, say you have a region of 6, 7, 10 counties, you've got to understand that even within that region, I hope what we have built helps you see that, yes, but this county is different from this county, and if somebody has a regional approach that works in some place with different kinds of counties, hopefully they can talk to people, they can talk to somebody who wants to try a regional approach and say, yeah, we had that same kind of challenge here. Counties X, Y, and Z were different than counties A, B, and C on these different factors, and you've got the same kind of situation, and maybe what we did could work for you. So I'm hoping that we're not calling for these places to be completely separate, but to acknowledge the differences between them. And when you're devising a regional approach, which I think is a good idea, you're taking into account the differences at the county level that will, I think, allow you to come up with a strategy that succeeds. Even within the region, like a standard strategy may not be as productive as understanding that within the region you need different approaches. Okay.